They lived under the same roof for years, but always separated by a cruel silence. As death approaches, he begs for one last chance with her. And what happens between them that night will be eternal. If you enjoy stories of love and romance, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave your comment saying where you're listening from. We continue. Perched atop a rocky cliff that rose above the turbulent waters of the Atlantic, on the Florida coast, the Saunders mansion defied time like a scar of marble and wrought iron against the perpetually overcast sky. Its colonial windows remained eternally open to the salty breeze that rose from the sea, carrying with it the smell of seaweed and memories that refused to die. It was there, in that decaying palace that once symbolized the absolute power of one of the country's most influential families, that Richard Saunders lived his final days. At 58, Richard still maintained the proud posture of someone who had commanded one of Latin America's largest pharmaceutical conglomerates for decades, but his body betrayed the royalty he tried to preserve. The degenerative disease that corroded his muscles advanced relentlessly, transforming the man who once decided the fate of millions into a shadow of his former self. His hands, once steady when signing contracts that moved billions, now trembled when holding a simple cup of coffee. The legs that had carried him through the corridors of power were beginning to fail, forcing him to rely on mahogany canes he hated using. He did not fear the death that approached slowly, like an inevitable tide. What terrified him was the prospect of being forgotten, of departing this world without having experienced true love, the kind that cannot be bought with power or won through threats. Throughout his life, Richard had collected women like trophies. Models, actresses, socialites who melted before his bank account and the prestige of his surname. But he had never felt that deep, visceral connection that made poets write verses and the lovesick commit crimes of passion. The Saunders empire had been built on foundations that few dared to question. Shadowy deals with corrupt governments, clinical trials conducted in impoverished communities in rural areas, where poverty made people vulnerable to promises of free treatments. Richard remembered perfectly the first time he authorized a human trial without following all safety protocols. He was young then, ambitious, driven by the thirst to surpass international competitors. When the first reports of serious side effects reached his desk, he filed them away. When the first deaths were recorded, he bought the family's silence. When the press began to investigate, he financed disinformation campaigns. Richard knew his hands were stained with blood, that each pill sold in his pharmacies carried the weight of lives sacrificed in the name of profit. He had built a monster that now devoured him from within, a guilt that no money could buy off or lawyer could absolve. But there was a wound in his soul that bled more than all the others, a scar that had a name: Hannah Carter. Hannah had arrived at the mansion 3 years earlier, hired to care for Michael, the illegitimate son of Richard's younger brother. The boy, then only 12 years old, was the result of a scandal that shook the family's foundations. His father, Paul Saunders, had become involved with heavy drugs and women of questionable reputation, frequenting luxury clubs in New York where he spent fortunes in a single night. The fall was swift and brutal. In a matter of months, Paul went from respected playboy to cocaine addict who sold family jewels to support his habit. The overdose that left him in a permanent vegetative state happened in a penthouse apartment in Miami Beach, in the company of 3 prostitutes and 2 synthetic drug dealers. Michael's mother, a club dancer named Carla, whom Paul kept as a mistress in an apartment in South Beach, discovered her pregnancy just days before the accident. After Paul's coma, she tried to blackmail Richard, demanding a fortune in exchange for silence about the child's existence. Richard paid, but Carla disappeared as soon as the money was deposited in her account, leaving the baby in the care of a neighbor who couldn't raise him. Michael arrived at the Saunders mansion like a ghost from the past, a constant reminder of the family's mistakes. Richard, who had never wanted children and always avoided lasting relationships, found himself responsible for a traumatized, rebellious child who cried every night calling for a mother who would never return. The boy was difficult, aggressive with the staff, rebellious at the private school where Richard enrolled him. Several nannies and governesses tried to care for him, but all gave up within weeks, unable to handle his anger outbursts and episodes of childhood depression. That's when the school principal suggested Hannah Carter's name. She had training in education and child psychology, but mainly had experience with traumatized children. Richard didn't expect much when he interviewed her via video conference, seeing only a shy 21-year-old who spoke softly and avoided looking directly at the camera. But something in her voice, a firmness disguised as delicacy, intrigued him. When Hannah crossed the mansion gates for the first time on a sunny March morning, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a flutter in his chest, an acceleration of his heartbeat that had nothing to do with his medical condition. She came from a small town in Georgia called St. Joseph's Clear Waters, where she had grown up within the walls of a convent, educated by nuns who taught her more about compassion and integrity than about the dangers of the real world. Hannah had been an orphan since the age of 8, when she lost her parents in a car accident on the road connecting her town to Atlanta. The couple was returning from a medical consultation in the capital, where her mother was being treated for breast cancer, when an out-of-control truck crossed into oncoming traffic and hit them head-on. Hannah survived because she was at her grandmother's house that day, waiting for her parents to return with the test results. Her grandmother died 6 months later from grief and advanced age, leaving the girl completely alone in the world. The nuns of St. Teresa's convent took Hannah in with the typical charity of those who see in others' pain an opportunity to serve God. Sister Benedicta, the Mother Superior, was an austere woman but with a kind heart, who recognized in the orphaned girl a rare intelligence and sensitivity that needed to be cultivated. Hannah grew up among Gregorian hymns and Latin lessons, among rose gardens and dusty libraries, where she discovered her passion for literature and human psychology. During adolescence, Hannah developed a routine that set her apart from the other girls under the nuns' care. Every afternoon after completing her studies, she walked to St. Vincent's Hospital, a charitable institution that served the region's poorest. There, voluntarily, she cared for terminal patients, reading to them, talking about their lives, offering comfort that their families often couldn't provide. It was in those corridors impregnated with disinfectant and silent despair that Hannah found her purpose. Dr. Edward Mitchell, the hospital director, soon noticed the young woman's natural talent for dealing with human suffering. Hannah had an almost supernatural ability to calm the most agitated patients, to draw smiles from those who had lost hope. She didn't just care for sick bodies, but for wounded souls, offering a comforting presence that medications couldn't provide. Dr. Mitchell began to entrust her with more complex tasks, allowing her to attend consultations and even participate in some decisions about palliative treatments. It was during this period that Hannah witnessed something that would mark her forever. The hospital had been selected to participate in a clinical trial program funded by a major pharmaceutical company. The project promised revolutionary treatments for previously incurable diseases, offered free of charge to patients who couldn't afford conventional therapies. Dr. Mitchell, pressured by the institution's lack of resources, agreed to participate in the program, despite having some reservations about the protocols presented. Hannah clearly remembered the first patient who died mysteriously, Mrs. Connie, a 70-year-old woman suffering from severe arthritis. She had volunteered to test a new anti-inflammatory that promised miraculous results. In the first few days, the medication really seemed to work. Mrs. Connie began walking without pain. Her fingers, deformed by arthritis, regained some mobility. But in the third week, she began to exhibit strange symptoms: mental confusion, nosebleeds, intense abdominal pain. Within 48 hours, she was dead. The official report pointed to cardiac complications unrelated to the experimental medication. But Hannah had spent hours at Mrs. Connie's bedside, listening to her complaints about the metallic taste in her mouth, constant nausea, the feeling that something was very wrong. She tried to alert Dr. Mitchell, but he reassured her, explaining that side effects were normal in any treatment and that the patient's death was an unfortunate coincidence. In the following months, 6 more patients participating in the clinical trials died in similar circumstances. All presented the same symptoms before death: disorientation, internal hemorrhaging, multiple organ failure. Hannah began making notes in a hidden notebook, recording each symptom, each complaint, each suspicious death. She tried again to talk to Dr. Mitchell, but this time he was more direct. If she continued asking inconvenient questions, she would be banned from returning to the hospital. The truth only came to light years later, when an investigative journalist from Atlanta published a series of reports on illegal tests conducted in rural hospitals. St. Vincent's Hospital was cited as one of the locations where poor patients were used as human guinea pigs, receiving experimental medications without the real risks being explained. Dr. Mitchell was arrested, accused of accepting bribes to facilitate the tests. Dozens of families sued the responsible pharmaceutical company, but the lawyers managed to suppress most of the cases through out-of-court settlements. Hannah, then 19, felt as if the ground had collapsed beneath her feet. The people she had cared for with such affection, whom she had watched suffer and die, had been sacrificed in the name of the profit of powerful men who would never set foot in that hospital. The outrage she felt was so intense that she considered abandoning her vocation of caring for others. How could she trust the medical system again? How could she work in hospitals knowing that behind the facades of benevolence lurked questionable interests? Sister Benedicta was the one who prevented her from giving up completely. The Mother Superior, already over 80, called Hannah for a conversation that lasted all night. She spoke about the difference between the system and the people, about how the evil practiced by some should not eclipse the good that others did daily. She explained that Hannah had a rare gift, an ability to bring peace to those who suffered, and that wasting this talent would be a way of allowing the powerful to win twice, first by killing the innocent, then by preventing someone from trying to console them. Convinced by the nun's arguments, Hannah decided to continue her studies, but with a specific goal. She wanted to specialize in palliative care, becoming a professional capable of offering dignity and comfort to those whom the medical system considered lost causes. She knew she couldn't save lives as doctors did, but she could do something equally important: ensure that people died in peace, surrounded by love and respect. It was this determination that led her to accept the job at the Saunders mansion. When she learned she needed to care for a traumatized child, Hannah saw an opportunity to apply everything she had learned about pain and healing. She didn't imagine that, by crossing the gates of that imposing property, she would be entering the territory of the man who, years earlier, had financed the clinical trials that had tormented her so much. Richard Saunders observed Hannah from the first moment with an intensity she found disturbing. There was something in his eyes that made her uneasy, a mixture of admiration and guilt that she couldn't decipher. During the first few days, he kept his distance, appearing only during meals or when he needed to discuss something related to Michael's care. But Hannah felt his gaze upon her constantly, as if he were studying every movement, every expression, every word she directed at the boy. Michael Saunders was a wounded child who expressed his pain through anger. At 15, he had become a withdrawn teenager who alternated between explosions of fury and prolonged silences that worried even the psychologists hired by Richard. None of the professionals could break through the barrier of distrust the boy had built around himself. He had learned very early that adults were unreliable creatures who promised love but disappeared when they were needed most. Hannah immediately realized that Michael didn't need another authority figure, but someone who saw him as a human being worthy of respect and understanding. In the first few days, she didn't try to impose rules or routines. She simply made herself present, offering her company without demanding anything in return. When Michael shouted, she remained calm. When he isolated himself in his room, she left food trays at the door and quietly walked away. When he broke objects in fits of rage, she collected them without complaints, only asking if he had hurt himself. Slowly, Hannah's strategy began to take effect. Michael began testing the limits of her patience, playing increasingly elaborate pranks to see if she would abandon him like everyone else. One morning, she found all her books thrown into the swimming pool. Instead of getting angry, Hannah asked Michael for help retrieving them, explaining that some were special gifts from the nuns who raised her. Together, they spent the afternoon trying to dry the pages in the sun, And it was at this moment that Michael asked his first personal question. Why didn't she have her own children to care for? Hannah's answer was honest but careful. She told him about her childhood in the convent, about how she had learned that there are many ways to be a mother, and that caring for him was one of the most rewarding experiences of her life. Michael, who expected a superficial or pious response, was surprised by her sincerity. For the first time in years, he felt that an adult was treating him as an equal, without condescension or falsehood. Richard watched this gradual transformation of Michael with a mixture of gratitude and melancholy. Hannah had accomplished in a few weeks what he had been trying to do for years: make the boy genuinely smile. He observed the two playing in the garden, studying together in the library, conversing during meals, and felt a strange pain in his chest. It wasn't just envy, but also a deep admiration for Hannah's ability to heal wounds that he didn't even know how to approach. The afternoons became Richard's favorite time. He pretended to work in his office, but actually spent hours watching Hannah and Michael through the windows. She had created a study routine that mixed school obligations with playful activities. She taught math using cooking recipes, explained geography through travel stories, brought literature to life through dramatizations in the garden. Michael, who previously saw studying as torture, began to show genuine interest in learning. But it was during one of these afternoons of observation that Richard noticed something that hit him like a punch to the stomach. Hannah was teaching Michael about the circulatory system using an anatomical dummy when the boy asked a question about medications and their effects on the human body. Her expression changed instantly. Richard saw a shadow pass over her eyes, a tension that took hold of her shoulders. She answered the question technically, precisely, but there was something in her voice that revealed too much knowledge about a subject that should be merely academic for someone of her age and background. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Something about Hannah's reaction deeply bothered him, awakening a paranoia he had cultivated over decades of dealing with people who could pose threats to his empire. He decided to investigate her past more thoroughly. Until then, he had been content with a superficial background check, focusing only on her professional capacity and the absence of criminal records. But now he wanted to know everything about Hannah Carter. The private detectives Richard hired were discreet and efficient. In a week, he had in his hands a complete dossier on Hannah's life, from her childhood in the convent to her academic training. It was while reading about her volunteer work at St. Vincent's Hospital that Richard felt the world collapse around him. The hospital's name was too familiar. He clearly remembered authorizing clinical trials at that institution years earlier during a phase of aggressive business expansion for Saunders Pharmaceuticals. Richard spent the night going through files in his private safe, looking for documents related to those trials. When he finally found them, his hands were shaking so much he could barely hold the pages. There were all the reports he had tried to forget, the severe side effects, the unexplained deaths, the silence agreements signed with desperate families. And there was also the name of Dr. Edward Mitchell, the hospital director, who had facilitated the tests in exchange for generous donations to the institution. The revelation was devastating. Hannah hadn't arrived at his home by chance. She knew exactly who he was, what he had done. But why would she agree to work for the man responsible for the death of people she had personally cared for? Was it revenge, blackmail, or something even more complex and dangerous? During the following days, Richard observed Hannah with growing paranoia, looking for signs that she was planning something against him. He checked if she had installed listening devices in his office, if she was photographing confidential documents, if she was in contact with journalists or authorities. But he found nothing suspicious. Hannah continued her normal routine, caring for Michael with the same dedication, treating the staff with the same kindness, behaving exactly like an ordinary young woman who was simply doing her job. The only perceptible change was in the way she looked at Richard. Before, her eyes reflected a shy, almost reverent curiosity. Now there was something different in that green gaze, an intensity he couldn't decipher. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't fear. It was something more subtle and disturbing, as if she were studying him, trying to understand who he really was behind the mask of respectability he had worn for so long. One night, while walking through the mansion corridors due to the insomnia that had become chronic, Richard heard Hannah singing in Michael's room. It was a lullaby he didn't recognize, melodious and sad at the same time. He approached the half-open door and saw a scene that deeply moved him. Hannah was sitting on the edge of the bed, stroking Michael's hair while singing softly. The boy who had spent years suffering from nightmares and insomnia was sleeping deeply, with an expression of peace that Richard hadn't seen for a long time. It was at that moment that Richard understood the terrible and liberating truth at the same time he was falling in love with Hannah. It wasn't just physical attraction, although she was incredibly beautiful. It wasn't just admiration for her professional competence, although she was extraordinarily talented. It was something deeper and more disturbing. He was falling in love with the woman who represented everything he had destroyed throughout his life. Hannah was the innocence he had corrupted, the compassion he had suffocated, the integrity he had sold in the name of profit and power. The following months were a silent torture for Richard. He found himself trapped in an impossible contradiction. The more he tried to keep his distance from Hannah, the more intensely he felt her presence. During meals, pretending indifference while she animatedly conversed with Michael about his progress at school was an exercise in self-control that left him exhausted. When she laughed at the boy's jokes, the sound echoed in his mind for hours. When she wore that blue dress that highlighted her green eyes, he needed to retreat to his office to regain his composure. Hannah, in turn, had noticed the change in, say, Richard's behavior, but interpreted his distance as disapproval. She believed that perhaps he was dissatisfied with her work, or that he was planning to dismiss her. The insecurity gnawed at her, especially because she had genuinely become attached to Michael and couldn't bear the idea of abandoning him when he most needed stability. The boy had completely transformed. His grades improved dramatically, the anger outbursts ceased, and he had even made some friends at school. A night of storm changed everything. The winds coming from the ocean were so strong they made the entire mansion vibrate, and the thunder echoed like cannons through the marble corridors. Michael, who still suffered from phobias related to loud noises, woke up in panic. Hannah ran to console him, but found the room empty. Desperate, she began looking for him throughout the house, shouting his name while the storm intensified outside. It was Richard who found her in the garden, soaked by the rain, looking for Michael among the trees that swayed violently. He was wearing only a t-shirt and pajama pants, but didn't hesitate to go out in the storm to help her. Together they searched every corner of the property until they found the boy hidden in the family's old chapel, a small Gothic building that hadn't been used for decades. Michael was crouched behind the altar, trembling with fear and cold. Hannah hugged the boy tightly, whispering words of comfort, while tears mingled with the rain on her face. Richard observed the scene with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. There was something sacred about that moment. Hannah, protecting Michael as a mother, would protect her child, offering her own body as a shield against his fears. When she raised her eyes and met Richard's gaze, he saw in them a deep gratitude, but also something more, recognition. As if finally she was seeing the real man behind the mask of power and coldness. The three returned to the mansion, wet and exhausted. Hannah took Michael to his room and spent the night beside his bed, ensuring the nightmares wouldn't return. Richard stayed in the hallway, unable to move away, listening to her sing softly until both she and the boy fell asleep. It was only then that he allowed himself to enter the room, just to cover her with a blanket. Hannah was sleeping in an uncomfortable chair, her face marked by fatigue but serene in her dedication. The next morning, when Hannah woke up, she found an envelope under her door. Inside was a handwritten letter, with Richard's elegant but trembling handwriting. He thanked her for everything she had done for Michael, acknowledged that he had never seen the boy so happy and balanced, and admitted that her presence had transformed not only Michael's life, but the entire atmosphere of the house. At the end of the letter, there was a strange request. If she could, he would like her to meet him in the library at 8 in the evening for an important conversation. Hannah spent the entire day speculating about what Richard wanted to discuss. Perhaps it was a proposal for her to move permanently to the mansion, or perhaps it was just the opposite, her dismissal. The insecurity accompanied her during all the day's activities, from the lessons with Michael to dinner, where she could barely eat while discreetly observing Richard. He also seemed nervous, quieter than usual, lost in thoughts she couldn't decipher. At 8 o'clock sharp, Hannah knocked on the library door. Richard was waiting for her, standing before the lit fireplace, with 2 glasses of wine on the mahogany table that dominated the center of the room. The library was impressive. Walls covered with books from floor to ceiling, mobile wooden ladders, leather armchairs that seemed to embrace whoever sat in them. Hannah had spent many afternoons there with Michael, but never at night, when the golden light of the lamps created an intimate and welcoming atmosphere. Richard offered her a glass, noting how her hands trembled slightly. Hannah accepted, but barely touched the wine to her lips. The tension between them was palpable, loaded with unspoken things that hung in the air like ghosts. Richard began by talking about Michael, praising the boy's extraordinary progress, but Hannah perceived that there was something more. So important, he wanted to say, and couldn't find the right words. Finally, Richard approached the window that overlooked the ocean and spoke without looking at her. He said he had discovered about her past at St. Vincent's Hospital, about her connection to the clinical trials he had funded years before. Hannah felt her blood freeze in her veins. The moment she had feared since her first day at the mansion had arrived. He knew who she really was, and now everything would change. But Richard's reaction wasn't what she expected. Instead of accusations or threats, he turned to her with eyes full of a pain Hannah had never seen before. He spoke about the mistakes he had made, about the lives he had destroyed in the name of ambition, about the weight of guilt he carried, like a stone in his chest. He said he didn't expect forgiveness because he knew his crimes were unforgivable, but he needed her to know that not a day went by without him deeply regretting every decision he had made. Hannah listened to everything, in silence, feeling a confused mixture of anger, sadness, and something she couldn't name. Part of her wanted to scream, accuse him of being a murderer, make him pay for each lost life. But another part saw a man shattered by guilt, someone who had lost his own soul in the process of building an empire and now lived haunted by the consequences of his choices. When Richard finished speaking, Hannah remained silent for a long time, looking at the fireplace where the flames danced like restless spirits. Finally, she said she had come to work for him knowing exactly who he was, that she had investigated his identity as soon as she learned about the job, that she had recognized the Saunders name in the documents she managed to obtain about the clinical trials. Richard was shocked. If she knew who he was, why had she accepted the job? Hannah's answer was simple and devastating, because she wanted to look into the eyes of the man responsible for the death of people she had loved as family. She wanted to understand how someone could make such cruel decisions and still manage to sleep at night. But over the months, seeing him interact with Michael, observing his loneliness, witnessing moments of genuine vulnerability, she had discovered something that surprised her. He wasn't the monster she had imagined, but rather a man who had completely lost himself and now lived imprisoned by the consequences of his own choices. Hannah's confession created a dense silence between them, loaded with truths both had avoided facing. Richard felt naked before her, more exposed than he had ever been before any person. Knowing that she had come there with the intention of confronting him, but had stayed even after truly knowing him, awakened in him an emotion he didn't know how to process. It was gratitude mixed with terror, relief tempered by a vulnerability that left him completely disarmed. Hannah approached the bookshelf, running her fingers over the spines of the volumes while organizing her thoughts. She spoke about Mrs. Connie, the first patient she had seen die in the clinical trials. She described how the lady had regained hope in the first days of treatment, how she had begun to dream of a future without pain, only to be betrayed by a system that saw her as disposable. Richard heard each word like a lash to his soul, imagining the face of each victim he had never personally known. When Hannah finished speaking, she turned to him with tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of hatred. They were tears of someone who had carried this weight alone for years, someone who could finally share the pain with the only person who could truly understand it. Richard took a step toward her, moved by an impulse he couldn't control, but Hannah raised her hand, asking him to keep his distance. She explained that she had spent the last few months trying to hate him, but had discovered something disturbing. It was impossible to hate someone who already hated himself so much. Richard lived in a prison of guilt and remorse that was more effective than any legal punishment. He had become his own executioner, slowly executing himself through isolation, loneliness, the inability to form genuine connections with other human beings. The conversation extended into the early morning. They talked about morality, about redemption, about the possibility of a person truly changing after committing unforgivable crimes. Hannah told about the nights she had stayed awake, imagining different ways to make him pay for his crimes, from reporting him to the authorities to more direct and personal methods. But she also spoke about how she had seen his humanity in the small kindnesses he demonstrated without realizing. The way he treated the mansion's older staff, the genuine concern for Michael's well-being, the moments when she caught him looking at the ocean with a deep sadness in his eyes. Richard, in turn, spoke about his childhood, about how he had grown up in a family where power was more valued than compassion, where financial success was measured in human lives, sacrificed at the altar of profit. He didn't try to justify himself or seek absolution, but wanted Hannah to understand that the monster he had become wasn't born ready, but was carefully cultivated over decades of morally questionable decisions that progressively became easier to make. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky with pink tones that reflected on the ocean, both were emotionally exhausted. Hannah stood up to leave, but Richard called her by name. She turned, and he said something that would change everything between them, that he had fallen in love with her, not despite who she was, but exactly because of it. Because she represented everything he had lost of himself, everything he could have been if he had made different choices. Hannah remained motionless for a long moment, processing the declaration. Then, in a voice so low he could barely hear, she admitted that she also felt something for him, but that this feeling terrified her. How could she love the man responsible for so much pain? How could she betray the memory of the people she had seen die in the name of his profits? It was a betrayal not only of her own convictions, but of all the victims he had made throughout the years. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion changed completely. Hannah and Richard consciously avoided each other, but the tension between them was so intense that even Michael noticed something was different. The boy began asking questions about why Hannah seemed sad, why Richard had gone back to locking himself in his office like in the old days. Michael's concern only intensified the guilt both felt. They had found a forbidden connection that threatened to destroy the stability the boy so desperately needed. Hannah seriously considered leaving the mansion. She packed her things twice, wrote resignation letters that she later tore up, even researched other job opportunities. But each time she looked at Michael, she saw how he had flourished under her care, remembered that abandoning him would be repeating the pattern of abandonment that had marked his entire life. The boy didn't deserve to pay for the emotional conflict she was experiencing. Richard, for his part, began taking drastic measures to distance himself from Hannah. He hired private tutors for Michael, hoping to reduce the need for her constant presence in the house. He began taking his meals in his office, avoiding the family dinners that had become his favorite part of the day. He even considered traveling to New York for a few weeks, just to create space between them. But fate, as always, had its own plans. Richard's disease, which had been progressing silently, took a sudden turn for the worse. One morning, Hannah found him fallen on the floor of his office, conscious but unable to get up. His legs had finally given out completely, and the tremors in his hands had intensified to the point of making it impossible to perform basic tasks like holding a glass or signing documents. Dr. Carson, Richard's personal physician, was immediately called. After a battery of tests, he confirmed what everyone feared. The disease had entered a terminal phase. Richard had at most 6 months to live. The news was devastating for Michael, who had finally found a father figure in his uncle. But it was even more devastating for Hannah, who realized that her feelings for Richard were deeper than she had admitted. Confronted with the reality of his mortality, Hannah made a decision that surprised her. She would stay. No matter the moral complications, no matter the pain it might cause, Richard was dying and she wouldn't allow him to face the last months of his life alone. But she established clear rules. She would care for him, as she would for any other terminal patient, with professionalism and compassion, but nothing beyond that. There would be no more intimate conversations, no more moments of emotional vulnerability. Richard accepted her conditions without questioning. He was grateful for any time he could spend in her presence, even if only as patient and caregiver. But both knew that the rules Hannah had established would be almost impossible to maintain. The love they had discovered for each other wouldn't simply disappear because they had decided to ignore it. The following months transformed the Saunders mansion into a place of extreme contrasts. On one hand, there was the medicinal routine that Hannah established to care for Richard. Strict schedules for medications, physical therapy sessions to delay muscle degeneration, special diets prepared by the cook under her supervision. On the other hand, there was a constant emotional tension that permeated every interaction between them, every glance exchanged, every accidental touch when she helped him move. Hannah had become an exemplary nurse, efficient and dedicated. She monitored Richard's vital signs, administered his medications with military precision, ensured he did the exercises prescribed by the physical therapist. But behind this professional mask, she fought daily against feelings that threatened to destroy her determination to maintain emotional distance. Each time she saw Richard struggling to perform simple tasks he once did without thinking, she felt a visceral pain that went far beyond professional compassion. Richard, in turn, had become a model patient. He followed all of Hannah's instructions without complaint, took the bitter medications without protest, submitted to painful exercises without showing weakness. But his eyes followed her constantly, memorizing her every movement, every expression, as if trying to engrave in his memory every second they spent together. He knew time was running out, and each day that passed was one less day he would have in her presence. Michael, initially frightened by the deterioration of Richard's health, gradually adapted to the new reality. The boy had matured rapidly in the face of the prospect of losing another father figure. He took on responsibilities he previously avoided, helping Hannah whenever possible, keeping Richard company when she needed to rest. The relationship between uncle and nephew deepened in a way that had never happened before, as if the proximity of death had dissolved the emotional barriers that existed between them. One night, while Hannah was bathing Richard, a task that required physical intimacy but which she executed with clinical determination, he finally broke the silence they had maintained about their feelings. With a weak but firm voice, he said he didn't regret falling in love with her, even knowing it was an impossible love. He said she had brought light to the last months of his life in a way he never thought possible. Hannah stopped what she was doing, her hands trembling slightly as she held the sponge. She wanted to say that he shouldn't talk about this, that they had agreed to maintain only a professional relationship, but the words didn't come out. Instead, she looked into his eyes and saw a brutal honesty, a vulnerability that completely disarmed her. Richard wasn't trying to seduce or manipulate her. He was simply being honest about his feelings, because he knew he wouldn't have many opportunities to do so. From that night on, the conversations between them became more intimate, more honest. Hannah began to share memories of her childhood. In the convent, stories about the nuns who raised her, dreams she had abandoned when she decided to dedicate herself to palliative care. Richard talked about his regrets, about the decisions he wished he had made differently, about how his illness had given him a completely new perspective on what really mattered in life. It was during one of these conversations that Richard made a revelation that shocked Hannah. He told her about a son he had fathered years before, the result of a relationship with one of the women who participated in the clinical trials at a hospital in upstate New York. The woman, named Carla, had become pregnant during the period when she was receiving an experimental medication for the treatment of severe depression. When she began experiencing complications during pregnancy, Richard took her to a private hospital in New York City, where she gave birth to a healthy boy. Carla died 2 weeks after giving birth, the victim of a hemorrhage that doctors believed was related to the side effects of the experimental medication. Richard, overcome with guilt and fear that the child's existence could expose the illegal tests, decided to hide his son from the world. He registered the boy with a false name, placed him under the care of a family of mansion employees, and invented a story about him being a local orphan who had been informally adopted by the family. The boy, now 25, lived in the back of the property under the identity of John Smith, working as a gardener and handyman. He was mute from birth, a condition that Richard secretly believed was a result of the medications his mother had taken during pregnancy. John didn't know his true paternity, sincerely believing he was just an employee who had grown up on the property. Hannah was horrified by the revelation. John's existence represented another layer of cruelty in Richard's legacy. Not only had he killed the boy's mother with his illegal experiments, but he had also denied the son the right to know his true identity. John lived as a ghost on the property where he should be the heir, working for the man who was his biological father, without ever suspecting the truth. The discovery of John completely changed Hannah's perspective on Richard. She had begun to believe that he was capable of redemption, that his remorse was genuine, and that perhaps he could find peace before dying. But knowing that he kept a son in emotional captivity, denying him the truth about his origin, rekindled all the anger she had tried to suppress. For days, Hannah avoided Richard, caring for him only when absolutely necessary and maintaining a professional coldness that she hadn't shown for weeks. Richard immediately noticed the change and understood that he had made a mistake in revealing the secret about John. He tried to explain that he had kept the truth hidden to protect the young man, that revealing the paternity would only cause more pain and confusion. But Hannah wasn't willing to listen to justifications. The tension between them reached the breaking point when Hannah decided to confront John directly. She found him in the garden, tending to the rose bushes that were his specialty, and tried to establish some kind of communication. John was a tall, strong young man, with features that vaguely resembled Richard's, but with a gentleness in his eyes that completely contrasted with his father's hardness. He communicated through gestures and expressions, and Hannah quickly realized he was more intelligent than his condition suggested. Through a combination of gestures, drawings, and patience, Hannah managed to establish a rudimentary form of communication with John. She discovered that he knew how to read and write, skills he had learned on his own by observing Michael's study. He demonstrated knowledge about medicinal plants, classical literature he found in the mansion's library, and even some basic principles of pharmacology he had absorbed by listening to conversations between Richard and his doctors. John's intelligence and sensitivity made it even more cruel that he lived in ignorance of his true identity. Hannah realized that he had spent his entire life questioning his origins, observing the Saunders family from afar, and wondering why he had been chosen to live there. The truth about his paternity would not only give him answers, but also the right to make his own decisions about his future. The discovery of John's existence had created an irreparable fissure between Hannah and Richard. For 2 weeks, she cared for him with a professional coldness that hurt him more than any symptom of his disease. Richard understood her anger, but also felt that he was rapidly losing the only person who had managed to see his humanity behind the crimes he had committed. With each day that passed without a kind look or a loving word from Hannah, he felt as if he were dying a little faster. Michael immediately noticed the change in the house's atmosphere. The boy, who had become accustomed to the growing harmony between Hannah and Richard, now witnessed a tension that left him anxious and confused. He tried to talk to both separately, but Hannah deflected the subject, and Richard simply said they were adult matters that shouldn't worry him. The unsatisfactory response only increased Michael's determination to discover what was happening. It was during one of these investigations that Michael came upon a scene that would change everything. He had gone out in the morning to look for Hannah and found her in the garden, teaching John how to write his own name. The young gardener was concentrated, carefully forming each letter in a notebook Hannah had given him. There was something in the scene that intrigued Michael, the dedication with which Hannah treated John, the infinite patience, the way her eyes shone when he managed to write a word correctly. Michael observed for a few minutes before approaching. Hannah explained that she was helping John improve his education, that she had discovered he was much more intelligent than people imagined. Michael, always perceptive for his age, noticed something strange in the way John looked at the mansion, a mixture of admiration and melancholy that suggested a deeper connection with that place than that of a simple employee. That night, Michael directly confronted Richard. The boy had matured greatly in recent months, and his approach was surprisingly mature. He said he perceived that something was wrong between Hannah and Richard, that the tension was affecting the entire house, and that he had the right to know what was happening, especially if it could result in Hannah leaving the mansion. Richard looked at his nephew for a long moment, seeing in him a reflection of himself at an age when there was still hope of becoming a better person. The honesty in Michael's gaze completely disarmed him. He had lied to so many people throughout his life, had hidden truths for convenience or cowardice, but couldn't lie to this boy who looked at him with genuine trust and love. Richard's confession about John was devastating for Michael. The boy was shocked to discover that he had a cousin living on the same property for years, someone he had seen countless times but never considered as family. The revelation also explained many things Michael had noticed but never questioned. Why John always seemed to know so much about the family. Why he cared for the property with a zeal that went beyond his professional obligations. Why his eyes lit up whenever he saw Michael playing in the garden. Michael demanded to properly meet John, not as employer and employee, but as cousin to cousin. Richard tried to explain the complications this could create, but Michael was inflexible. He said he had already lost many people in his life, that he wouldn't allow another family member to live as a stranger just because of the wrong decisions of adults. The meeting between Michael and John was emotional and complex. Michael, with his typical youthful frankness, tried to explain the situation through gestures and drawings. John, initially confused, gradually began to understand what the boy was trying to communicate. When he finally understood that Michael was calling him cousin, that he was trying to say they were family, John collapsed in silent tears. Hannah observed the meeting from afar, feeling her heart break as she saw the genuine emotion of both young men. John had spent his entire life feeling like an outsider, someone who didn't truly belong anywhere. Michael, who had suffered with abandonment and rejection, instantly recognized the pain of someone who also felt invisible. The connection between them was immediate and deep. In the days that followed, Michael took on the mission of integrating John into the family. He insisted that his cousin dine with them, participate in the house's activities, be treated as a family member and not as an employee. Hannah completely supported this initiative, seeing in it an opportunity to correct at least part of the injustice that had been committed against John. Richard watched this transformation with contradictory feelings. On one hand, he was genuinely happy to see John finally receiving the recognition and affection he deserved. On the other hand, the situation only intensified his guilt, showing him clearly how his decisions had deprived not only John, but also Michael of a family relationship that could have enriched both their lives for years. The change in family dynamics had an unexpected effect on Hannah. Seeing Michael's generosity, John's silent gratitude, and even Richard's genuine pain in confronting the consequences of his actions began to soften the anger she had cultivated in recent weeks. She began to realize that Richard wasn't just the monster she had created in her mind, but also a complex person, capable of genuine love and remorse. One night, while helping John write a letter to himself where he expressed his feelings about discovering his true identity, Hannah had a revelation. John wrote with his still uncertain but determined handwriting that he didn't feel angry about having lived in ignorance for so many years. Instead, he felt grateful to finally know the truth, to have the chance to form a real relationship with Michael, to be able to be himself for the first time in his life. John's emotional maturity, his ability to forgive without bitterness, made Hannah question her own moral rigidity. If John, who had been the greatest victim of this whole situation, could find peace and forgiveness, who was she to cling so tenaciously to anger? She began to realize that her inflexibility wasn't helping anyone, only creating more suffering, in a situation that had already caused enough pain. Hannah's change in perspective coincided with a significant worsening in Richard's health condition. Dr. Carson had reduced his life expectancy estimate to 2 months, perhaps less. Richard's muscles were deteriorating rapidly, and he had begun to have difficulty swallowing, a symptom that indicated the disease was affecting basic vital functions. Confronted with the imminent reality of Richard's death, Hannah realized she had wasted precious weeks maintaining an emotional distance that served only to protect her own pride. She had become a nurse to bring comfort and dignity to people in their final moments of life, but was denying exactly that to the man she had fallen in love with, regardless of the moral complexity of that passion. That night, after Michael and John went to sleep, following another session of exchanging stories and attempts at communication, Hannah entered Richard's room determined to have an honest conversation about the time they had left. She found him awake, looking out the window at the ocean that stretched infinitely under the full moon's light. Richard turned when he heard her enter, and Hannah saw in his eyes a mixture of hope and resignation that deeply moved her. Without saying a word, she approached the bed and for the first time in weeks held his hand. The skin was cold and the veins prominent, but the grip was firm and full of meaning. The touch of Hannah's hand broke a barrier that Richard had built around his heart during the weeks of coldness between them. He had prepared himself to die alone, convinced that he had forever lost the only person who had managed to see his humanity behind the crimes he had committed. Now, feeling the warmth of her skin against his, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps he could find some form of peace in the days he had left. Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, keeping Richard's hand between hers. Her voice was low but firm when she began to speak. She said she had spent the last few weeks fighting against her own feelings, trying to reconcile the love she felt for him with the anger she carried for the victims of his crimes. She had discovered that it was possible to love someone and at the same time condemn their actions, that the human heart was complex enough to harbor seemingly impossible contradictions. Richard heard each word as if it were an absolution, not for the crimes he had committed, but for the condemnation of dying without love. Hannah explained that she had made a decision. She would spend the last months of his life by his side, not just as a nurse, but as the woman who had fallen in love with him despite everything. She couldn't forgive his crimes, but she could forgive the man he had become after recognizing the magnitude of his failings. From that night on, the atmosphere in the Saunders mansion changed drastically. Hannah returned to caring for Richard, with the tenderness she had shown before the discovery about John, but now with an even greater emotional depth. She began dividing her nights between his room and her own, always present when he needed her, but also taking care of herself so she could offer the best possible care. Michael and John became inseparable partners, developing their own language that mixed gestures, drawings, and facial expressions. John had moved to a room in the main house, abandoning the staff quarters where he had lived for years. The transformation in him was remarkable. For the first time in his life, he genuinely smiled, participated in family meals, and even began to show interest in learning about the family business. Richard observed this new family dynamic with a mixture of joy and melancholy. Seeing John finally being treated as a son brought him deep satisfaction, but also intensified his regret for the lost years. He had deprived John not only of an identity, but of decades of family love that could never be recovered. During an intimate conversation with Hannah, Richard expressed his desire to do more for John before dying. He wanted to legally formalize the recognition of paternity, ensure that John received an adequate education, and mainly ensure that the young man had sufficient resources to freely choose his future. Hannah completely supported these initiatives, seeing in them genuine signs of redemption. The process of legally recognizing John as Richard's son was complex, involving specialized lawyers and DNA tests. John participated in everything with so silent dignity that impressed all the professionals involved. When the results officially confirmed the paternity, John hugged Richard for the first time in their lives. It was a moment loaded with emotion for the entire family, especially for Michael, who finally saw his cousin receive the recognition he had always deserved. With John's legal situation resolved, Richard began working on his last project, a foundation that would offer free and dignified medical care to underprivileged communities, specifically focused on compensating for some of the injustices his companies had committed in the past. Hannah was designated as the foundation's director, a position that would allow her to channel her experience in palliative care toward a greater purpose. The creation of the foundation aroused media interest, especially because it involved the public admission of questionable practices by Saunders Pharmaceuticals. Richard decided to be completely transparent about his past crimes, offering detailed testimonies to investigative journalists who had spent years trying to expose the company's illegal practices. The public confession was devastating for his reputation, but also deeply liberating. Hannah accompanied Richard during all the interviews, holding his hand when the questions became particularly difficult, offering water when his voice failed due to the progression of the disease. She saw a man who had decided to face his past actions with courage, even knowing that it would destroy any positive legacy he might have hoped to leave. Public reactions to Richard's confessions were mixed. Some victims' families expressed gratitude for finally receiving official acknowledgement of what they had suffered. Others rejected any attempt at redemption, arguing that no amount of charity could compensate for the lost lives. Hannah understood both reactions, but maintained her conviction that allowing Richard to die in peace was the right choice for her personally. During this tumultuous period, Richard's health continued to deteriorate rapidly. He had lost significant weight, his voice was weaker, and periods of lucidity began to alternate with moments of mental confusion. Dr. Carson continuously adjusted the pain medications, but warned that a time would come when even the strongest painkillers would not be enough. One night, when the pain was particularly intense, Richard made a request that surprised Hannah. He said he wanted to record a message for her, something she could listen to after he died. Hannah initially hesitated, fearing it would be a very painful experience, but Richard insisted, explaining that there were things he needed to say while he still had the strength to do so. The recording was made in his office, in the presence of only Hannah. Richard spoke about how she had transformed his life, about how her love had given him courage to face his mistakes, about how she represented everything that was best in humanity. He expressed his gratitude for her choosing to stay by his side, despite everything, and asked that she continue her work of caring for others even after he was gone. More importantly, Richard recorded specific instructions about his wishes for after his death. He wanted Hannah to continue caring for Michael and John, to officially assume guardianship of both if they agreed. He wanted the foundation to become his main legacy, compensating for some of the lives he had destroyed. And he wanted Hannah to know that despite all his crimes, the months they spent together had been the most significant of his life. When the recording ended, both were emotionally exhausted. Hannah helped Richard back to bed, and for the first time since they had met, she lay down beside him, just holding him while he slept. There was nothing physical beyond the comfort of being together, but it was a moment of emotional intimacy that definitively sealed the impossible love they had found in each other. In the weeks that followed, Richard's strength declined rapidly. He spent most of the time sleeping, waking only for brief periods of lucidity, during which he looked for Hannah with his eyes. Michael and John took turns keeping him company, reading to him, telling him about their daily activities. The house had become a place of silent vigil where everyone awaited the inevitable end that approached. The last week of Richard's life was marked by an unexpected serenity. The physical pain had reached levels that required constant sedation, but in moments of lucidity, he demonstrated a peace that surprised even Dr. Carson. It was as if, having finally confronted all his demons and received forgiveness from the only person whose opinion really mattered to him, Richard could face death without the terror that had tormented him for years. Hannah didn't leave his side. She had established a routine that ensured he never woke up alone. During the day, She alternated with a private nurse to monitor his vital signs, administer medications, and ensure his comfort. During the night, she slept in an armchair beside the bed, waking at the slightest sound or movement that indicated he needed something. Michael and John had taken on the responsibility of keeping the house running. The 15-year-old boy and the 25-year-old young man formed an unlikely but efficient duo, coordinating domestic activities, receiving visits from lawyers and doctors, and mainly taking care of each other during that difficult period. The maturity forced by circumstances had created between them a connection that went far beyond the condition of newly discovered cousins. John, especially, had gone through a profound transformation during the last few months. Having his identity recognized, being treated as a family member, and mainly receiving Michael's unconditional love, had awakened in him a confidence he never knew he possessed. He had begun to express himself through writing, creating small poems, and reflections that he shared with Hannah during her moments of rest. One of these compositions touched Hannah in a particular way. John had written about forgiveness, about how discovering that he had been deprived of his identity for years could have filled him with anger, but instead had taught him about the importance of valuing each moment of genuine love he received. His words, written with the still uncertain handwriting of someone who learned to write as an adult, contained a wisdom that deeply impressed Hannah. Dr. Carson had warned that Richard had at most a few days to live. His vital organs were beginning to fail, and he spent most of the time unconscious. Hannah knew the end was near but wasn't prepared for the conversation Richard initiated during one of his last moments of full lucidity. With a weak but determined voice, Richard said he wanted Hannah to promise something important, that she wouldn't waste her life feeling guilty about the love they had shared. He explained that he perfectly understood the moral complexity of their situation, but firmly believed that true love was always a gift, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. Hannah tried to protest, saying they should enjoy the time they had left instead of talking about the future, but Richard was insistent. He said the only thing that worried him about death was the possibility that she would carry the weight of having loved an imperfect man. He wanted her to know that it had been her love that gave him the courage to try to redeem himself, that without her he would have died as the monster he had been for most of his life. That same night, Richard asked to see Michael and John together. With great difficulty, he managed to sit up in bed with Hannah's help. The two young men approached, and Richard managed to hold both their hands. His message was simple, but deeply emotional. He asked them to take care of each other, to remember that they were family not just by blood, but by choice. He asked them to forgive the mistakes he had made and to build a better future than the past he was leaving behind. Michael, with tears in his eyes, promised that he would always care for John as a brother. John, unable to speak but not to express himself, hugged Richard with a strength that surprised everyone, communicating through the gesture all the gratitude he couldn't verbalize. It was a moment of farewell that definitively sealed the family bonds that had formed in recent months. The next morning, Richard could no longer speak. Hannah remained by his side, holding his hand, whispering words of comfort and love. She had decided that, regardless of any moral judgment others might make, she loved this man and wasn't ashamed of that love. He had been capable of genuine change, had faced his failings with courage, and had found redemption through the love they shared. Dr. Carson had left clear instructions about the signs that would indicate the proximity of the end. Richard's breathing had become irregular, his blood pressure was dropping, and he no longer responded to external stimuli. Hannah knew these were the last hours, perhaps the last minutes. She leaned over him, whispering in his ear all the things she had kept in her heart for months. She said she loved him, that she didn't regret any moment they had spent together, that he had become a better man in the last months of his life. She said she would care for Michael and John as if they were her own children, that the foundation would become the positive legacy he hoped to leave. Most importantly, Hannah said she had learned from him about the complexity of forgiveness, about how it was possible to love someone without approving of all their actions, about how redemption was always possible for those who had the courage to face their failings. She said he had died as a good man, regardless of the mistakes he had made in the past. Richard died at sunset, with Hannah holding his hand and Michael and John at the foot of the bed. His last breath was peaceful, without struggle or agony. Hannah gently closed his eyes, kissed his forehead, and remained beside the body for hours, processing the mixture of pain and relief she felt. The man she loved had found peace, and that was all that really mattered. The preparations for the funeral were simple, according to Richard's expressed wishes. He would be cremated, and his ashes scattered in the ocean he had contemplated for so many years from his bedroom window. There was no formal religious ceremony, just an intimate gathering with Hannah, Michael, John, and some old mansion employees who had developed genuine affection for their employer during his last months of life. Hannah found strength in the need to care for Michael and John during those first days after Richard's death. The two young men were processing not only the pain of loss, but also the radical transformation of their lives. Michael had lost another father figure, but this time had had the opportunity to say goodbye properly and to receive genuine love before the separation. John was experiencing grief for the first time, a complex emotion for someone who had just discovered what it meant to have a true family. 6 months after Richard's death, the Saunders mansion had transformed into something completely different. What was once a somber palace inhabited by ghosts of guilt and loneliness had become a true home, full of life, laughter, and purpose. Hannah had officially assumed guardianship of Michael and John, a legal formality that only made official something that already existed in their hearts. They were a family, united not just by circumstances, but by genuine love and mutual commitment. The Richard Saunders Foundation had become an impressive reality. Hannah divided her time between administering the foundation and directly caring for patients in a clinic that was built on the grounds of the old mansion. The clinic offered free palliative care to people from underprivileged communities, exactly as Richard had dreamed. It was ironic, but also deeply appropriate, that the man who had caused so much suffering in the healthcare system was now remembered for an institution dedicated to alleviating the pain of the most needy. Michael, now 16, had become a confident and compassionate young man. The emotional stability he found with Hannah and the discovery of having a brother in John had completely healed the traumas of abandonment he had carried for years. He was excelling academically and had developed an interest in medicine, inspired by Hannah's work at the foundation. His plans included pursuing a medical career, specifically in palliative care, to continue the legacy of compassion that Hannah had initiated. John had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. With the recognition of his identity and access to formal education, he had discovered an exceptional intelligence for botany and pharmacology. Hannah had managed to get him accepted into a special adult education program at the University of Florida, where he studied through classes adapted to his condition. His professors were impressed with his ability to understand complex concepts and his dedication to his studies. John's communication had also evolved significantly. Hannah had found a specialized speech therapist who worked with him to develop alternative forms of expression. Although he still didn't speak, John had become fluent in sign language and had developed a personalized communication system that mixed gestures, facial expressions, and assistive technology. He could clearly express himself on any subject, from his deepest emotions to complex academic concepts. The relationship between Hannah, Michael, and John was extraordinarily harmonious. They had created their own family traditions, dinners where each shared the most important events of the day, walks on the beach at sunset, reading sessions where they took turns reading aloud to each other. John had become particularly skilled at cooking, discovering he had a natural talent for combining flavors and creating dishes that were true culinary masterpieces. One of the most surprising discoveries had been John's musical aptitude. Hannah had noticed how he reacted intensely to music and decided to give him a piano as a gift. To everyone's amazement, John revealed he had perfect pitch and an instinctive capacity for composition. He created complex and emotional melodies that communicated feelings words couldn't express. His compositions became the soundtrack of family life, played during special dinners and moments of celebration. Hannah herself had found a form of peace she hadn't imagined possible. The love she had felt for Richard hadn't disappeared with his death, but had transformed into something different, a deep gratitude for the experience of having completely loved someone, despite all the moral complexities involved. She had learned that the human heart was capable of extraordinary contradictions, that it was possible to love someone whose actions were condemnable, and that this contradiction didn't make her a worse person. The work at the foundation had become more than a profession for Hannah. It was a vocation that gave her purpose and meaning. Each patient who received dignified care in their final days, each family who found comfort in the moment of loss, represented a small victory against the unnecessary suffering that Richard had caused in the past. It was a way of transforming pain into healing, of using the lessons learned from impossible love to create something positive in the world. 1 year after Richard's death, on a date that marked the anniversary of their first intimate conversation, in the library, Hannah decided to listen again to the recording he had made for her. It was a deeply emotional experience, hearing his voice speaking about love and redemption, about how she had transformed his life. But this time, instead of pain, Hannah felt mainly gratitude. Richard had died in peace, surrounded by love, having found a form of redemption through honesty and charity. During this reflection, Hannah made an important decision. She decided to write a book about her experience, not as a form of self-exposure, but as an exploration of the moral complexities of forgiveness and love. The book, which she titled Letters to an Impossible Man, would become a bestseller, touching thousands of people who faced their own moral dilemmas about forgiveness and redemption. The book's proceeds were entirely allocated to the foundation, allowing the expansion of services to other cities in rural Florida. Hannah received invitations to speak at universities and medical conferences, sharing her unique perspective on palliative care and on how love can coexist with moral judgment. Michael had become a constant source of pride for Hannah. He not only maintained excellent grades at school, but also volunteered at the foundation whenever possible. His natural compassion and ability to connect with terminal patients constantly reminded Hannah of why she had chosen that profession. The boy who had arrived at the mansion as a wounded and angry child had transformed into a young man who radiated kindness and determination. John continued to surprise everyone with his evolution. He had begun to write, creating stories and poems that explored his unique experience of discovering his identity as an adult. His texts were published in specialized literary magazines, and he had become an important voice in the discussion about the rights of people with communication disabilities. Universities began to invite him for lectures about overcoming an identity, presentations he gave through interpreters and assistive technology. The mansion, which before was a symbol of isolation and guilt, had become a center of life and activity. Hannah had transformed several rooms into functional spaces for the foundation, a medical library, consultation rooms, living spaces for patients' families. The garden that John cared for with so much love had become a place of meditation and peace for people facing loss and grief. One afternoon, while watching Michael and John playing soccer in the garden, an activity they had developed using gestures and signs to communicate during the game, Hannah reflected on how life had taken unexpected turns. She had arrived at that house at 21, driven by anger and a thirst for justice. Now at 24, she had found a family, a purpose, and a deep understanding of the complexity of human nature. The love she had felt for Richard continued to be an important part of who she was, but no longer as a source of moral conflict. It was a precious reminder of how true love could transform people, how forgiveness could coexist with accountability, how it was possible to find redemption even in the most unlikely circumstances. That night, Hannah climbed to the balcony of the room that had been Richard's, now transformed into her personal office. The ocean stretched infinitely before her, exactly as he saw it every night during his last months of life. She opened the notebook where she wrote letters she would never send to him, a therapeutic practice she had developed to process her feelings. In that night's letter, Hannah wrote about gratitude. She thanked for having known true love, even if it had come through impossible circumstances. She thanked for Michael and John, who had become the children of her heart. She thanked for the opportunity to transform pain into healing through the work at the foundation. And mainly, she thanked for having learned that redemption was always possible, that love could triumph over the deepest remorse, and that a life could be measured not by the mistakes of the past, but by the courage to try to correct them. As she wrote, Hannah felt Richard's presence not as a haunted ghost, but as a blessed memory. He had found peace, she had found purpose, and together they had created a legacy of love that would continue impacting lives long after they were all